Dinner at my parents' house in the suburbs of Atlanta always felt like walking into a performance I never auditioned for. The table was long covered in the same white tablecloth my mother used every Sunday, the air thick with the smell of roasted chicken and the tension that never quite left our family. My father sat at the head as if presiding over a court. My brother Ethan had the place of honor to his right. I took the chair nearest the kitchen where the light flickered whenever the air conditioner kicked in. I tried to breathe through the unease that curled in my stomach. Ethan reached for the wine bottle before the blessing and poured himself a full glass, smirking at me as he raised it. 33 years old, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, and still not married, still living in that tiny apartment, still wasting time on whatever you call your job. I smiled weakly, cutting my chicken. Software engineering, I said, because repeating it out loud made it sound legitimate, even though I knew what was coming. He laughed, sharp and mean. Sure, software engineering. Mom, she probably just fixes printers for a living. My father chuckled under his breath. The old chandelier above us buzzed faintly. I felt my pulse in my ears. I tried to steady my voice. I actually work on contracts for women's employment platforms, I said. Ethan leaned back, swirling his wine. That's adorable, he said, like you're saving the world one unpaid invoice at a time. His wife wasn't there tonight. She rarely stayed for family dinners when things got tense, which meant they were always tense. My mother set another dish down. Honey, maybe if you focused on finding a husband instead of playing boss lady, you wouldn't be eating alone every night. The laugh that followed cut straight through me. I swallowed hard. You know what, Mom, I said softly. At least I'm not drunk again before dessert. The words came out faster than my brain could stop them. The laughter died. Ethan's smirk froze, his eyes narrowing as if he hadn't heard right. What did you say? He asked quietly, dangerously. My father looked up, his jaw tightening. Ethan, drop it, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. I forced myself to meet his eyes. I said, maybe you shouldn't drink so much. The next few seconds stretched thin like glass about to shatter. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile, the sound sharp enough to make me flinch. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He stepped around the table, his breath reeking of wine. You think you're better than me now? He spat. I stayed seated, gripping my fork under the table. You're drunk, Ethan, sit down. He laughed once, a short, bitter sound. You've always been a disappointment, he said, leaning closer. Useless. You hear me, useless. The word echoed in my chest like it had when we were children. My mother whispered his name again, but he ignored her. I saw the flash of movement before I felt it. The glass in his hand flew from his fingers, hitting the wall behind me and shattering into bright fragments. Then his palm came across my face with a sound that cracked the silence. My chair tipped backward. The world tilted with it. I remember the ceiling spinning, the chandelier swinging like a pendulum, my father's voice a blur of noise. Then something hard hit the back of my head. A flash of white exploded behind my eyes. For a moment, everything stopped. I was aware of the cold tile against my cheek, of the copper taste of blood in my mouth, of my mother gasping but not moving. I heard my father's voice, low and furious, saying, Ethan, that's enough. Ethan's breath came heavy above me. I couldn't open my eyes. I tried to speak, but only a faint sound escaped. Somewhere distant, the doorbell rang. The neighbor's voice called out, asking if everything was all right. My mother answered quickly, Everything's fine, just an accident. Then there was silence again. Time folded. My heartbeat slowed. The last thing I remember before darkness took me was the sound of glass crunching under someone's shoe and my brother whispering she should have kept her mouth shut. When I opened my eyes again, the world was tilted. Light bled into my vision in long white lines. For a second, I thought I was still at the table, that maybe it had been a dream, but the smell was different, antiseptic and metal. The beeping of a monitor pulsed in rhythm with my head. My throat hurt when I tried to swallow. I moved slightly, and pain shot through my skull like lightning. A nurse leaned over me. Ma'am, you're in the emergency room, she said gently. You hit your head pretty hard. Do you remember what happened? Her face was kind, but my mind was foggy. I tried to piece it together, the laughter, the glass, Ethan's eyes, the floor coming up too fast. I croaked out, Who brought me here? She glanced at the clipboard. A neighbor found you on your parents' porch unconscious. My pulse quickened. My parents, are they here? The nurse hesitated. I don't think so. She patted my arm. Try to rest. When she left, the room felt impossibly quiet except for the steady machine beside me. I turned my head toward the window where the city lights blurred through the rain. Every movement made me dizzy. I reached for my phone on the tray. 5 missed calls from work, none from family. My thumb hovered over Mom's number. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring, her voice clipped. You provoked him, she said before I could speak. You always push too far. I closed my eyes, swallowing the ache. Mom, he hit me. I was unconscious, she sighed. You embarrassed him, that's what happened. Your father's furious the neighbors heard the whole thing. Then she hung up. The line went dead, leaving a silence that felt colder than the hospital air. I stared at the ceiling until the pattern of the fluorescent lights blurred into stars. For a moment, I wondered if maybe she was right, if I had provoked him, if every word I'd ever said to defend myself had just made things worse. Then I felt the throb in my skull and the sting on my cheek and realized how absurd that sounded. I hadn't provoked anything. I'd just finally spoken the truth aloud. The doctor came later explaining I had a mild concussion, that I'd need rest and someone to watch me for the next 24 hours. I nodded, though I knew there was no one. When he left, I lay still listening to the hum of machines and the rain against the glass. The curtain moved slightly as the nurse peeked in again. She smiled softly. You should call someone to pick you up tomorrow. Okay? I wanted to tell her there was no one to call, that family was supposed to mean safety, but for me it only meant bruises and silence. As I closed my eyes, I thought about the dinner table, the sound of Ethan's voice calling me useless, the way my mother looked away. For years I had believed their words defined me, but lying there in that sterile room, the smell of antiseptic in my lungs and the sting of betrayal sharper than the wound on my head, I felt something shifting inside me, something small but alive. It wasn't anger yet. It was awareness, like the first spark before a fire. I didn't know it then, but that night would be the line that divided my life in two before the blow and after it. The sound of glass shattering would echo in my memory for months, but it would also become the sound of something else breaking free inside me, something that would never go back to silence again. The fluorescent lights above me hummed like angry bees as morning crept through the blinds. I hadn't really slept, only drifted in and out of shallow dreams where the chandelier kept spinning above my head, each rotation ending with the crack of Ethan's hand across my face. The nurse checked my vitals again, cheerful but efficient, the way people get when they've seen too much pain to flinch anymore. She asked if I had family to stay with me for the next 24 hours. I hesitated, then said no. She frowned, scribbled something on her clipboard, and left me with a cup of water that tasted like metal. My throat burned with every swallow. My reflection in the monitor's black screen startled me. A deep purple bruise bloomed along my jawline. My lower lip split in the middle. I looked like someone else, someone weaker, but also someone who had survived. My phone buzzed on the tray beside me, lighting up with a number I didn't recognize. It was the responding officer. His tone was flat routine. "Ma'am, we've filed a domestic incident report," he said. "Looks like it was a mutual altercation. We'll be recording it as a misdemeanor battery." My pulse spiked. Mutual, I was unconscious. The officer coughed softly. "Ma'am, that's how it appears in the preliminary statement. You can follow up if you want to press civil charges later." He sounded bored, like he was discussing a parking violation. I wanted to scream to tell him that this wasn't mutual, that I hadn't even stood up from the table before he hit me, but my voice came out small. "So, that's it," he said quietly. "We see this a lot. Family disputes. Best to let it cool off." Then he thanked me for my cooperation and hung up. I stared at the phone until the screen went dark again. For the first time in years, I felt the shape of helplessness, not as fear, but as heat, thick and choking. Silence protects abusers. The sentence formed in my head so clearly it might as well have been whispered by the walls. The doctor stopped by mid-morning, explaining concussion symptoms and follow-up appointments. He spoke gently, eyes flicking toward the bruise under my ear. "Do you feel safe to go home?" he asked. The question hung there. I wanted to say yes because saying no would mean admitting my family wasn't safe, and people like me weren't supposed to have unsafe families. I nodded. He didn't believe me, but he signed the discharge anyway. Around noon, a nurse helped me into my clothes. Each movement sent pain through my skull, but I smiled, said thank you, and held my head high. My phone was still silent. No text from Mom, no call from Dad, not even a message from Ethan pretending to be sorry. The only notification was a voicemail from my boss reminding me of an overdue project. I laughed short and bitter because work was the only place where things made sense. Outside, the air was cold and wet. A drizzle clung to the parking lot like mist. I called a rideshare, giving the driver my apartment address in Decatur. As I waited under the hospital awning, I saw a familiar car drive past, my parents' silver SUV. It slowed at the light long enough for me to recognize my mother's profile in the passenger seat, my father gripping the wheel. They didn't look my way. The light turned green and the car moved on. I watched it disappear until the driver pulled up and asked if I was okay. I nodded again. That had become my default answer. The ride was quiet. The driver had gospel music playing low, the kind of songs that sound like hope even when you don't believe in it. When we reached my building, I tipped him more than I could afford and climbed the stairs, slowly gripping the rail when the dizziness hit. Inside my apartment, the air smelled faintly of lavender and machine oil. My laptop was still open on the table, the last email draft half finished. A photo of my project proposal blinked on the screen. It was a small app connecting women in tech with freelance opportunities, something I had been building for months between contract jobs, believing in it when no one else did. I looked at it now and felt both pride and absurdity. My brother called me useless, but this was mine. I tried calling my mother again. She answered on the third ring, her voice tired but sharp. "What now?" she said. I swallowed hard. "I just wanted to know if you're okay." "We're fine," she replied. "You've caused enough trouble." "Ethan feels terrible. He didn't mean it. You need to drop this before it ruins the family." My grip tightened on the phone. "He hit me hard enough to knock me out, Mom." "Do you hear yourself?" She sighed as if I were the one exhausting her. "Don't exaggerate. You always do this." He said, "You grabbed his arm first." My stomach dropped. He said, "What?" "That's what the officer told us. You need to think about your part in this." I wanted to laugh, but the sound stuck in my throat. I said softly, "My part was getting hit." She went quiet for a moment, then said, "Your father doesn't want you coming around until things calm down. You embarrassed us." Then she hung up. The silence afterward roared louder than any fight we had ever had. I sat on the floor back against the couch, staring at the window where raindrops streaked down the glass. The city outside moved on without me. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably drinking again, laughing, telling himself I'd deserved it. Somewhere in that same house, my parents were eating dinner, pretending nothing had happened. I felt the first tear slip down my cheek, hot and humiliating. I pressed my palms to my face and let the sob come quietly, not because of the pain, but because of the realization that I had no one left to call family. When the tears stopped, what remained wasn't despair. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you've hit the bottom and see exactly who's standing over you. My phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. "This is Officer Daniels. You can pick up your report tomorrow at the precinct if you plan to file civil action." I read it twice. Civil action. The words tasted strange, powerful. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and betrayal, a small voice whispered, "Maybe it's time." I looked at my reflection in the dark window. The bruise on my jaw had deepened to violet. My lips swollen, my eyes red but alive. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like someone who had survived the worst and was still breathing. That was the first night I slept without dreaming of the chandelier. The next morning, the sunlight through the blinds felt too sharp, like it was cutting through the fog in my head. I moved slowly, every motion sending a pulse through the bruise at the base of my skull. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I could finish it. My mind kept circling back to the same question: how did we end up here? I didn't have to think long before the memories started crawling back uninvited and vivid as if my brain had been waiting for a crack in the present to spill them through. I was 8 when I first learned that Ethan's mistakes were my responsibility. He had thrown a baseball through the neighbor's window, and when the man stormed over, red-faced, Mom had smiled tightly and said, "Boys will be boys." Then she turned to me and whispered, "Don't tell your father." I nodded, even though it wasn't my secret to keep. Later that night, Dad came home angry about the bill, and somehow it was me who got scolded for not watching my brother closely enough. That pattern repeated for decades until it became a rhythm I didn't notice anymore. Ethan broke, I fixed. Ethan shouted, I apologized. Ethan lied, I covered. It was the family choreography. When we were teenagers, the imbalance grew teeth. He was 16, tall and loud, full of the arrogance boys wear like armor. I was 14, quiet and bookish, always trying to earn praise that never came. One summer afternoon, he came home furious from football practice. He had been benched for missing a play, and he took it out on me. I was sitting on the porch steps reading when his shadow fell over my page. He snatched the book from my hands and threw it into the yard. "What are you gonna do, cry about it?" he sneered. When I tried to push past him, he shoved me. I fell backward off the steps, scraping my elbow raw. Mom came out just in time to see me on the ground. Instead of helping, she yelled, "Stop being dramatic, it's just a scratch." Ethan looked guilty for half a second, then smiled when she turned away. I remember the sun behind him blinding and hot, and the realization that the rules in our house didn't apply to everyone equally. At 17, I got my first part-time job at a diner down the road. I was proud of it, proud of earning my own money, even if it was only minimum wage. I used my first paycheck to buy Dad a new tie for his birthday. He barely looked at it. Ethan walked in later with a six-pack and a grin, tossing his arm around Dad's shoulders, saying, "Don't worry, old man, I'll make real money one day." Dad laughed, clinking bottles with him. My tie sat unopened on the counter for weeks. The message was clear. Love was measured in noise, not in effort. By the time we were in our 20s, the distance between us had hardened into something sharp. Ethan got a construction job, lost it within months for showing up drunk, and moved back home without shame. I went to college on scholarships and worked nights to pay rent, but Mom still sent Ethan grocery money while telling me I was selfish for not visiting more often. When I graduated, she didn't come to the ceremony. She said, "You know your brother's not doing well. It would be cruel to celebrate right now." So I took the diploma photos alone, smiling for a camera that didn't care. I remembered the night I tried to tell her about the way Ethan had grabbed me once years later when he was angry about money. We had been arguing in the driveway. He'd had too much to drink again. I told him he needed to get help, that I couldn't keep covering for him. His hand shot out and gripped my arm so tight I thought my bones would snap. When I pulled away, bruises bloomed the next day in the shape of his fingers. I called Mom, voice shaking, and she sighed like I was making things complicated. "He's under pressure," she said. "You know how he gets when he's stressed. Don't provoke him." The word provoke had become her shield for every sin he committed. It was the word she'd use again after the dinner that sent me to the hospital. It always came back to that same twisted logic: he hurt me, therefore I must have deserved it. The memories rolled on like a film I couldn't stop. The Christmas he got a new truck while I got a second-hand coat. The family photo where Mom pushed me to the side so Ethan could stand in the center. The birthdays forgotten, the apologies never given. Each one a brick in the wall that had built the version of me who sat at that dinner table years later, still hoping for their approval. I thought about how people talk about family in Hallmark movies: forgiveness, unconditional love, unity. Ours was a different kind of story, the kind that looked perfect from the outside but hollowed you out from within. We smiled for pictures, hosted neighbors, went to church. No one ever saw the cracks, the hierarchy carved by gender and pride. Dad's favorite phrase echoed in my head: "He's a boy, he'll take care of you someday." Maybe that was the cruelest joke of all. I walked to my closet and opened a small box buried under old clothes. Inside were photographs and report cards, fragments of the girl I used to be. In one photo, Ethan and I were standing by the lake, him grinning, me squinting against the sun. Mom had written on the back, "My two blessings." I traced the words with my thumb until they blurred. That girl still believed those words were true. I didn't anymore. As the day wore on, the past and present overlapped until I could hardly tell them apart. The same ache I'd felt as a child settled in my chest, but now it burned instead of stung. I realized that every time I had stayed silent to keep the peace, I had taught them how to hurt me. Every time I forgave without accountability, I'd handed them permission. Maybe that was why lying on the hospital floor, bleeding and half conscious, the only thought I'd had wasn't fear, but recognition. This was always where it was headed. Violence was just the final language of a family that had been practicing cruelty in softer tones for decades. By evening, the memories began to quiet, leaving behind a strange calm. I wasn't angry at the little girl who tried to earn love from people who couldn't give it. I was angry for her. And that anger, steady and sharp, felt like the beginning of something I hadn't known. I was missing the will to stop being their victim. The day after I got home from the hospital, the world felt muted, like someone had turned the volume of life down just low enough that I could hear my own thoughts for the first time. The bruises on my face had darkened to a sick shade of violet spreading like spilled ink along my jaw. Every time I moved, a dull ache pulsed behind my eyes, reminding me that this wasn't a nightmare. It had happened. My brother had hit me, my mother had excused it, and the police had filed it away as nothing more than a family disagreement. I made coffee I couldn't drink and stared at the steam curling into nothing. The apartment was still too still, the kind of silence that made every heartbeat sound like a confession. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The last email I'd received before dinner was still there unread. It was from a foundation I'd applied to months ago, a women's innovation grant. I clicked it without much hope. The first line said, "Congratulations, your project proposal has been approved for funding." My hands trembled. I read it again and again until the words made sense. The app I had been quietly building, the one everyone had mocked, was finally real. They had chosen me, the useless one. I laughed, a hollow, disbelieving sound that quickly dissolved into tears. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The same day my family decided I was worthless strangers, had decided I was capable of changing something. For years I'd been waiting for their validation and it had never come. But here it was arriving from a world that didn't know me, didn't judge me, didn't care about my family's rules. I printed the letter and held it in my hands, the paper trembling slightly as if it understood how fragile this moment was. When the phone rang, I half expected it to be my mother calling to apologize to say she'd been wrong. But it was a friend from work, her voice hesitant. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "Are you okay?" I lied and said yes because that's what you say when you're too tired to explain. She paused before adding, "I hope you're pressing charges." That's assault. The word stuck to me like a spark. Assault. Not argument. Not misunderstanding. Assault. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the bruise on my reflection in the laptop screen, feeling something shift in my chest. Fear was still there, heavy and familiar, but underneath it was something else, something colder and cleaner. Resolve. I spent the next few hours gathering what little I had: photos of the bruises, the hospital report, the voicemail from the officer. I didn't know what I was doing, only that doing nothing felt unbearable. Around sunset, the sky outside turned the color of old copper, and for a moment, the apartment glowed. I stood by the window watching people hurry home, couples holding umbrellas together, families laughing as they crossed the street, the kind of simple normalcy I'd never really had. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Mom. "Please don't tell anyone. It will only make things worse." I stared at it for a long time before typing back, "Worse for who?" Then I deleted the message and threw the phone onto the couch. I couldn't stop shaking. Every memory of her voice defending Ethan replayed in my head like static. "You provoked him. Don't exaggerate. Think of the family." For years, I'd mistaken that tone for love. Now it sounded like control. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dinner table, the glint of the wine glass, the shock of pain when the world went white. I sat up, grabbed a notebook from the drawer, and started writing. Not code, not work notes, but everything I remembered. The words poured out faster than I could think. The insults, the times he'd shoved me, the moments they'd dismissed it all. I wrote until my hand cramped until the page blurred with tears. When I finally stopped, the clock read 3:12 a.m. My chest hurt, but the air felt lighter. I'd written myself back into existence. By morning, the decision had formed quietly without drama, like a stone sinking to the bottom of a lake. I was done waiting for them to fix what they broke. I showered, dressed, and stood in front of the mirror. The bruise had started to fade at the edges, yellow creeping into the purple, but the woman staring back didn't look small anymore. She looked tired, yes, but determined. I whispered to her, "You're not the weak one. They just needed you to believe it." Before leaving for the doctor's follow-up, I slipped the printed grant letter into my bag. It felt like armor. When I stepped outside, the November air bit at my skin, sharp and alive. I passed my neighbor, Mrs. Lane, the one who had called 911 that night. She looked startled to see me. "Are you all right, honey?" she asked. I managed a smile. "Getting there." She hesitated, then said, "I saw everything on my doorbell camera. If you ever need it, I'll give you a copy." I froze. For a second, I couldn't breathe. "You saw him hit me." She nodded, eyes soft. "You didn't deserve that." My throat tightened. "Thank you," I whispered. That simple offer, so small, so decent, cracked something open inside me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about proof, about finally being heard. That afternoon, I called the precinct and asked for the case report. The officer sounded surprised but indifferent. When I hung up, I scrolled through my contacts and found the number of a lawyer I'd once met at a tech conference. I didn't know if she handled assault cases, but it didn't matter. I needed someone who spoke the language of truth louder than my family's denial. As evening fell, I lit a single candle on the counter and sat beside it watching the flame flicker against the shadows. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet, not as loneliness, but as space to think, to breathe, to choose. My hands were still trembling, but the fear had changed shape. It wasn't holding me anymore. It was warning me not to stop. "If they think I'm weak," I whispered, "let's see how strong silence can be." The next morning, I sat at my desk, the grant approval letter spread out in front of me like a small miracle surrounded by chaos. The bruise on my jaw had faded to a pale yellow, but the ache inside hadn't dulled. I was sipping lukewarm coffee when the email from the precinct arrived. It contained the case report number and the officer's name. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days: control. I looked up the number of a lawyer whose name I remembered from a tech conference last year, Sarah Donnelly. She had spoken about advocacy for women in tech, about how silence was the system's favorite accomplice. I found her firm's website and dialed. A warm voice answered. "This is Sarah." I swallowed hard. "My name is Claire Thompson. We met at a conference in Atlanta last spring. I need help." There was a pause, then the professional steadiness of someone used to hearing things that break people. "What kind of help?" she asked. I exhaled slowly. "My brother hit me. The police called it a family matter. I ended up in the hospital. I want to know what I can do." She asked for details. I told her everything, my words stumbling at first, then spilling out like they had been waiting for permission. When I finished, there was silence on the line, except for the faint clicking of her keyboard. "What happened to you is not just a family matter," she said finally. "It's assault. But because the police classified it as misdemeanor battery, they won't pursue felony charges unless there's clear evidence of intent to cause serious injury. Do you have any proof?" My heart quickened. My neighbor mentioned her doorbell camera might have caught something. Sarah's voice sharpened. "If that footage shows the assault, we can use it. Bring everything you have: hospital records, texts, photos. I can meet you tomorrow morning." The next day, I drove downtown to her office, a modest brick building tucked between a coffee shop and a florist. Sarah was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a calm intensity that made you feel both exposed and safe. She listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, she folded her hands. "Claire, this will be hard," she said. "Once you start, you can't unring the bell. Your family might turn against you." "They already have," I said quietly. She nodded. "Then let's start by gathering evidence. I can file a civil suit for assault and battery separate from the police report. It won't send him to jail, but it will create a record that says what happened was real. That matters." She paused, studying my face. Do you want to press charges later? I hesitated. The thought of court of facing Ethan again made my stomach twist. I don't know yet. Sarah leaned forward. Then don't decide now. Just prepare. The law moves slowly, but it listens when you bring receipts. We spent hours organizing everything. She made copies of the hospital discharge papers, printed the photos I'd taken of my bruises, and drafted a statement in my own words. She read it back to me line by line. It sounded strange hearing my pain translated into legal language, Exhibit A, Exhibit B, but also empowering. It made it real. When we finished, she looked at me over the stack of papers. You did nothing wrong, she said. I wanted to believe her, but years of conditioning made the words feel foreign. As I was leaving, she handed me her card. If they contact you, record every call, every message. Keep everything. Abusers love revisionist history. Driving home, the city blurred past my window, gray and bright all at once. I stopped at the grocery store for the first time since the hospital. Every stranger who glanced at my healing bruise made me flinch. I told myself they weren't judging, just curious. Still, I kept my eyes down. Back at the apartment, I played Sarah's words in my head. You did nothing wrong. Maybe if I heard them enough, they would start to feel true. That night, I opened my laptop and started documenting everything again this time like evidence instead of confession. Dates, times, exact words. I scrolled through my messages with Ethan, years of passive insults disguised as jokes. Found one from last year. Don't forget you owe me for that time I covered your rent. He never had. I added it to the file anyway. I went through family group chats reading how my mother had always taken his side and saved screenshots of every message that hinted at the pattern. Each file felt like a small reclaiming of power, a story I was finally rewriting in my own favor. Around midnight, I got an email from Sarah. She'd spoken to a colleague who specialized in domestic assault law. If the footage existed, we could file a motion to reclassify the incident, which could force a formal investigation. She ended the message with, "You're stronger than you think, Claire." I sat there staring at the sentence until the words blurred. Maybe I was. Or maybe strength was just the name people gave you when you refused to stay silent. Before bed, I called Mrs. Lane. She sounded relieved to hear from me. "Of course, dear," she said when I asked about the video. "I can send it to your lawyer directly. My husband saved it the night it happened. You were lying on the porch when I called 911. I closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "You don't know what that means." "Actually," she said softly, "I do." After we hung up, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The fear was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't the fear of being hurt again. It was the fear of finally being seen. I thought about how every woman I knew had been told to keep the peace, to forgive, to protect someone else's comfort. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe silence had been loyalty to the wrong people. I turned off the light, the apartment sinking into darkness, and whispered into the quiet. That was the moment I stopped protecting the man who put me in the hospital. 2 days after meeting with Sarah, my phone lit up with Mom's name. For a full minute, I watched it ring thumb, hovering over decline, but curiosity won. Her voice was clipped polite, too calm. "Your father wants us all to sit down," she said. "Talk this out before it gets worse." I almost laughed. Worse for who, I asked. She ignored the question, insisting, "Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. We'll have dinner. Don't make this harder than it already is." The line went dead before I could answer. I told Sarah about it later, expecting her to say no, stay away, but she only said, "Go if you can handle it." Sometimes seeing their faces helps you decide what you're really fighting. The next evening, I drove back to the house I'd grown up in, the one that always smelled faintly of lemon polish and control. The porch light was on bright and sterile. I paused on the steps where the blood had dried days ago, the memory flickering in my head like a ghost. Inside, the house looked the same: family portraits, clean surfaces, silence, heavy enough to crush you. Mom was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like guilt disguised as soup. Dad sat at the table, newspaper open but unread. Ethan was there too, wearing a pressed shirt, hair slicked back, trying for remorse. I almost turned around, but Mom's voice stopped me. "Sit, Claire. We need to talk." I sat across from Ethan. The bruise on my face must have startled him because he looked away quickly. Mom placed a bowl in front of me like this was just another family meal. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then she cleared her throat. "You can't sue your own brother." Her tone was gentle, like she was explaining something to a child. I didn't answer. Dad folded his paper and finally looked at me. "Your mother's right. What happened was regrettable, but dragging this into court will destroy us." "Us!" I repeated the word sharp. "He hit me, Dad. That's not us. That's him." Ethan leaned forward, trying for charm. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Claire. You know how heated things get." I wanted to scream. Instead, I said quietly, "You knocked me unconscious. That's not heat, Ethan, that's violence." He winced, then looked to Mom for backup. She delivered it like a reflex. "He's your brother. You made him hit you." The words landed like a slap harder than his. My chest tightened. I stared at her, searching for any sign of doubt, any flicker of the mother I had once believed in. None. Just composure. "You raised him to believe he could," I said. Her spoon froze halfway to the pot. "Don't twist this, Claire. We're trying to protect the family. Protect it from what I asked, from truth, from accountability." Dad's voice rose for the first time. "Enough. You're making a scene." I laughed soft and bitter. "That's what you said the night he hit me." Ethan slammed his palm on the table, the sound loud enough to make Mom flinch. "I said I was sorry. What more do you want?" The apology was hollow performed. I met his eyes. "I want you to admit what you did without blaming me for it." He looked away again, jaw tight. "I've got nothing else to say." Mom sighed, turning toward me. "You're being dramatic, Claire. Let it go. Families fight. You're both adults. Don't ruin your lives over one mistake." "One mistake." My voice cracked. "He put me in the hospital." For a moment, the room was silent except for the clock ticking above the fireplace. I realized then that no one in this house had ever said my name without using it as a reprimand. "Claire, lower your voice. Claire, don't provoke him. Claire, be reasonable." Tonight, it sounded different, like an echo of the girl they'd spent years trying to erase. I pushed back my chair and stood. Mom looked up sharply. "Where are you going?" "Home," I said. "You are home," Dad insisted. I shook my head. "No, this is your house, not my home." Mom's voice softened for the first time. "We love you, sweetie, you know that." My throat tightened, but I forced a smile that felt like breaking glass. "Love doesn't look like this. If it did, I'd still be lying on your porch." I grabbed my coat. Behind me, Ethan muttered something under his breath, probably calling me crazy. I didn't turn around. At the door, I paused, hand on the knob. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for leaving. I felt free. The night air hit my face like water, cold and clean. I walked to my car, started the engine, and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The faint bruise, the steady eyes, the quiet defiance. As I pulled away, I saw them through the window. Mom standing by the sink, her shoulders shaking Dad's hand on her arm. Ethan staring down at his phone. Maybe he was already texting someone, rewriting the story again. She provoked me. She overreacted. She's crazy. Let him. This time, I had evidence. This time, his version wouldn't win. The road was empty except for the hum of the tires beneath me. I didn't cry until I reached the traffic light at the edge of town. The tears came all at once, not from sadness, but release. Years of swallowed words spilling out in one silent flood. The red light reflected off the windshield painting everything in the color of warning, the color of beginning. I wiped my face and whispered no more. Then I drove on, leaving the house behind like a crime scene that no longer needed witnesses. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with my clothes still on and the smell of rain drifting through the cracked window. My phone blinked with 2 unread messages from Sarah. One said, "Any update on the footage?" The other, "Don't forget to photograph every injury again today before it fades." I sat up slowly, the dull ache in my head still humming like an old engine, and reached for my camera. The bruise on my cheek had turned a pale greenish yellow the last stage before disappearing, but I wanted it frozen in time. Evidence doesn't care about healing. I snapped the photos, labeling each one with the date. When I finished, I emailed them to Sarah and stared at the screen until her reply came through within minutes. "Perfect," she wrote. "Now, let's get that video." I walked across the street to Mrs. Lane's house, nerves twisting in my stomach. Her porch was covered in hanging plants and a small American flag fluttered beside the mailbox. When she opened the door, her eyes softened. "Oh, honey, you look better," she said. I told her Sarah would reach out for the footage, but she insisted I take a copy myself too. Her husband had already downloaded it onto a flash drive. She handed it to me like a sacred object. "I didn't realize how bad it was until we watched it," she whispered. "You fell so fast. He didn't even help you." I thanked her, trying to ignore the burn in my throat, and promised to bring the drive back soon. Back at my apartment, I plugged it into my laptop. The video was grainy but clear enough. There was the porch, the faint glow from the dining room, my silhouette at the doorway, Ethan's shadow behind me. Then the movement. His hand, the shove my body collapsing out of frame. A second later, he stepped over me, looked around, and went back inside. The timestamp blinked in the corner like a pulse. Watching it made my stomach turn, but it also steadied me. I wasn't crazy. It wasn't mutual. It was there in pixels, undeniable. When Sarah saw the clip that afternoon, her voice changed. "Claire, this is gold," she said. "It proves everything. With this, we can reclassify the case and file civilly at the same time." I asked if the police would actually care. She hesitated. "They'll have to, but don't expect them to apologize for getting it wrong." She explained the next step's chain of custody notarized copies affidavits. I took notes, each word feeling like a brick in the wall I was finally building for myself. Before we hung up, she said, "Keep every voicemail and text, especially from your family. They'll reach out soon and not to say sorry." She was right. That evening, Mom called again, her tone deceptively calm. "Claire, we heard you're talking to lawyers. This needs to stop before it ruins Ethan's life." I took a deep breath. "He ruined his own life when he hit me." She sighed like she was the victim. "You don't understand how this looks. People will talk." I looked at the laptop screen, the frozen frame of Ethan standing over me, and said, "Good. Let them." She went silent, then muttered, "You're making a mistake," and hung up. Over the next few days, I turned my apartment into a command center. Sarah sent templates for evidence logs and affidavits. I printed everything, organized it in folders labeled by date and subject. Hospital records officer report photos, texts, video stills. The stack grew until it covered half my dining table. The more I collected, the lighter I felt. Every piece of paper was a counterweight to the years of gaslighting that had convinced me none of it mattered. I learned that justice wasn't a single event. It was a process of documenting your pain until the world couldn't look away. On Thursday, Sarah called with an update. The civil complaint was ready to file. It would name Ethan as defendant for assault and emotional distress. She asked if I was ready for what would come after. I said I wasn't sure, but I wanted to do it anyway. "That's enough," she said gently. "We'll file tomorrow." That night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint noise of cars outside. I thought about the courtroom. I hadn't yet seen the moment when the truth would finally stand taller than the excuses. Fear and excitement mixed until I couldn't tell which was which. Around midnight, another text came through from an unknown number. "You really gonna drag your own brother through court? Think about Mom and Dad." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a signature. I took a screenshot and saved it in the folder marked Threats. Then I turned off my phone. The next morning, I met Sarah at the courthouse downtown. The building smelled like old paper and rain. As we walked through the security check, she smiled slightly. "You're doing the right thing, Claire. It might not feel like it yet, but you are." We submitted the documents to the clerk, and with a dull stamp of approval, it became official. My name versus his. Seeing it in print made my hands shake. Afterward, Sarah treated me to coffee across the street. She told me about her first case, how scared her client had been, how she'd won anyway. I listened, trying to absorb her steadiness. When she asked how I felt, I said, "Like I'm standing at the edge of something and I can't see how far down it goes." She nodded. "That's how freedom feels at first. Terrifying." That night back in my apartment, I opened the window and let the air in. The city sounded alive again, cars, sirens, laughter in the distance. I sat at my desk and watched the glow of my laptop screen illuminate the folder that now held my life. Photos, reports, videos, words. Proof that silence could be broken piece by piece. For the first time since that night, I didn't feel small. I felt like someone preparing for battle, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. I whispered to the darkness, if truth hurts them, then maybe pain finally has purpose. The lawsuit was filed on a gray Friday morning, the kind of day that made everything feel suspended between endings and beginnings. Sarah told me it could take weeks before Ethan was officially served, but it happened faster than either of us expected. 3 days later, while I was working on my laptop, a text from Mom appeared on my screen. "What did you do, Claire?" The sheriff just came to the house. I stared at the words until they blurred. My heart pounded, half fear, half relief. It was real now. Not just whispers or hospital bruises, there was a case number paperwork witness as evidence. By evening, the calls started. Mom first, then Dad, then Ethan. I let them all go to voicemail. Sarah had warned me, don't engage no matter what they say. Still, each ring felt like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. The next morning, my inbox flooded with messages from family friends. Heard about Ethan. What's going on? Is it true I didn't answer any of them? Instead, I forwarded everything to Sarah. She replied with one line. They're scared. That's a good sign. On the third day, a letter arrived in the mail handwritten by Mom. The envelope smelled faintly of her perfume. I sat on the couch staring at it before tearing it open. The words inside were an emotional ambush. She begged me to drop the case, said Ethan was drinking again because of me, that the stress might destroy the family. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the folder labeled Evidence. It hurt less that way, turning guilt into documentation. News travels fast in suburban neighborhoods. By the end of the week, Mrs. Lane texted me that she'd overheard people at church whispering. Some were sympathetic, others weren't. Family business shouldn't go public, one woman had said. The old rule, the one that kept women like me quiet. But this time, the silence belonged to them, not me. Ethan's official response came through his lawyer 2 weeks later, a letter denying all allegations. According to his statement, I had been hysterical and aggressive and he had acted in self-defense. Reading it made me dizzy. Sarah called it predictable. Abusers rewrite reality, she said. That's why you keep evidence. She was right. Every photo, every message, every video frame was an anchor in a storm built on lies. As the legal process unfolded, the emotional fallout hit harder than I'd expected. People I thought were friends started avoiding me. A coworker quietly removed me from a group chat. At first, I wondered if I'd done something wrong, if my pain had made me inconvenient. Then I remembered something Sarah once said during our first meeting. When you hold abusers accountable, you remind people what accountability looks like. Some will admire it, some will run. I spent most evenings in silence reading over the paperwork, reminding myself why I started. One night while organizing files, an unknown number called. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Ethan. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You really think this will fix anything, Claire?" he asked. "You're tearing Mom apart. You're humiliating us." I wanted to hang up, but I forced myself to listen. He went on, saying he barely touched me, that I had made him look like a monster. When he finally paused, I said quietly, "The video shows you hitting me." There was silence on the other end. Then a low laugh, the kind that made my skin crawl. "You'll regret this," he said and hung up. I forwarded the call log to Sarah. She responded almost immediately. "Good. Another record. Every thread is another nail in his case." I realized then that even his attempts to intimidate me were backfiring. The more he tried to manipulate, the more evidence he created. A few days later, something unexpected happened. I received a message on social media from a woman named Lindsay. She wrote, "I used to work with your brother. I saw what you're doing. You're brave. He hurt a lot of people." My stomach twisted as I read her story, how Ethan had berated her at work, sent threatening texts when she filed a complaint, and how the company had quietly transferred him instead of firing him. She attached screenshots, old emails, proof of a pattern. I printed them and added them to the growing pile. Sarah was thrilled. "This isn't just one bad night anymore," she said. "This is a history." The hearing date was set for mid-December. As the day approached, my parents' messages grew more desperate. Mom called one night sobbing into the phone. "He's your brother Claire. Blood is blood." I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the sound of her crying, but felt nothing but exhaustion. "Love doesn't mean silence," I said. She stopped crying instantly. Her voice turned cold. "You sound just like those women on TV who ruin men's lives for attention." Then she hung up. That was the moment something inside me hardened. I realized she would never understand because understanding meant admitting her own role in it. The denial wasn't just protecting Ethan, it was protecting her illusion of control. The story where she was a good mother and I was just difficult. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. The day before the hearing, I met Sarah at the courthouse to review everything one last time. The folder was heavy in my hands, filled with the weight of proof. She smiled slightly as we sat down. "You ready?" I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Ready for justice, for truth, for whatever came next. "Maybe." I just nodded. She said softly, "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember, you already did the hardest part. You told the truth out loud." That night, I went for a walk through the city, the winter air biting against my skin. Christmas lights hung in shop windows bright and oblivious. Couples laughed as they passed by their lives untouched by courtrooms or betrayal. I stopped at a small park watching the fountain spray mist into the cold air. My breath came out in clouds. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about fear or guilt. I was thinking about the version of myself that had sat bleeding on that porch, the woman who believed her pain didn't matter. I whispered to her through the wind, "We're almost there." When I got home, there was one last text waiting for me from an unknown number. It read simply, "You won't win." I stared at it until my reflection blurred in the phone's glass. Then I smiled. I didn't need to win. I just needed the truth to stop hiding. I screenshotted it, saved it, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the story that was always mine to tell. The courthouse was colder than I expected, a maze of marble and echoing footsteps where every sound carried too long. I stood outside the courtroom doors, clutching a folder so tightly the edge of it cut into my palm. Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're ready," she said quietly. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but I nodded anyway. When the bailiff called our case, the sound of my name and Ethan's together in one sentence made my stomach twist. Inside, the room smelled like paper and nerves. A female judge sat behind the bench, her expression unreadable, her hair pulled back in a silver bun that gave her an air of quiet authority. Ethan was already seated with his lawyer, a man in a navy suit who looked like he'd practiced sympathy in the mirror. My parents sat behind him close enough that I could see Mom clutching her purse like a lifeline. She didn't look at me. The clerk read the charges aloud, civil suit for assault and emotional distress. My voice sounded distant when I confirmed my name. Ethan's lawyer rose first, smooth and confident. He painted a picture of a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion, a sister with emotional instability, a brother unfairly accused. His words were polished, rehearsed, perfectly false. He described the night as mutual, said Ethan had only defended himself when I lunged at him. I stared straight ahead, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. Every word felt like acid in my throat. When it was Sarah's turn, she walked to the center with the calm of someone who'd lived through storms before. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't about family drama. This is about accountability." She held up the hospital report, then the photos. "These are not the result of a misunderstanding. They are the result of violence." Her tone was firm but steady, each sentence landing like a stone. Then she gestured toward the monitor set up by the clerk. "Your Honor, with permission, we'd like to present video evidence." The judge nodded. The lights dimmed slightly. The footage began. Even though I'd seen it dozens of times, my body tensed the moment the porch came into view. The faint glow, the shadows moving, then the shove. The sound of impact echoed faintly from the speakers. I watched my own body collapse limp and small. There was a collective inhale from the room, the kind of silence that cuts deeper than noise. Ethan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The judge leaned forward slightly. When the video ended, Sarah didn't speak for a moment. She let the silence do the work. Then she said softly, "That's not mutual. That's assault." Ethan's lawyer tried to recover, objecting that the video didn't show what happened before the incident, that context was missing. Sarah countered immediately. "Context doesn't erase gravity," she said. "It explains it, and here the context is a lifetime of intimidation." She introduced my testimony next. My voice trembled at first, but the judge's calm presence steadied me. I described the dinner the words exchanged the blow. I told the court about waking up in the hospital alone, about my mother's voice telling me I'd provoked it. As I spoke, Ethan stared at the table, his jaw locked. When Sarah asked if he'd ever hurt me before, I hesitated, then told them about the shove years ago, the bruises brushed off as accidents. The judge's pen paused mid-note. Then Sarah played the voicemail Ethan had left after the lawsuit was filed. "You'll regret this," his voice hissed through the speakers. The words filled the room like poison. My parents flinched. Ethan's lawyer requested a recess, but the judge denied it. We continued. Sarah submitted the printed messages from his old coworker Lindsay, describing his history of verbal threats. Each page turned felt like another layer of his defense peeling away. When the defense finally called Ethan to the stand, he tried to look remorseful. His lawyer guided him, gently painting him as a man pushed too far. He said he'd been under stress, that he'd only wanted to calm me down. I watched him try to mimic humility, but his eyes gave him away, still cold, still proud. Sarah approached him for cross-examination. Her voice was quiet but surgical. "Mr. Thompson, when you said you'll regret this, what did you mean?" He shifted. "Just that she shouldn't drag family through court." Sarah nodded. "So it wasn't a threat?" "No." She smiled faintly. "Then why send it anonymously from a different number?" He froze. She held up the printout. "Your phone records confirm it was you." The room fell silent again. Ethan's face reddened. My father whispered something to him, but it was too late. The damage was done. When closing arguments began, Sarah didn't dramatize. She spoke simply. "Abuse doesn't always happen in strangers' homes," she said. "Sometimes it's at your own dinner table. Sometimes it wears your last name. The truth doesn't need volume. It just needs to be heard once." Then she looked toward me, and she finally was. The judge took her time reviewing the documents. The wait felt endless. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but sharp. "The evidence is clear. The video, the medical report, the threatening messages all point to a pattern of aggression inconsistent with the defense's claim." Her eyes lifted to Ethan. "Mr. Thompson, your behavior constitutes battery under the law. The ruling is in favor of the plaintiff." She paused as the sound of shuffling filled the courtroom. "You are sentenced to 18 months probation, mandatory counseling, 100 hours of community service, and a restitution fine of $5,000. The gavel struck once firm and final. Case closed. The air left my lungs all at once. For a moment, I couldn't move. The weight I'd carried for years suddenly felt lighter and unfamiliar. Sarah squeezed my shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. As we gathered our things, I looked over at my family. Mom's eyes were wide, shocked, but not at the violence, at the embarrassment. Dad avoided my gaze entirely. Ethan sat motionless, staring at the floor, his mask of control finally cracked. When I walked past them, neither of my parents spoke. I didn't either. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the cold air hit me like a baptism. The courthouse steps gleamed under the winter sun. People hurried by their lives, moving normally, unaware of the quiet revolution that had just taken place inside me. Sarah stood beside me, adjusting her coat. "How do you feel?" she asked. I looked out at the horizon, the city skyline sharp against the pale sky. "Like I can finally breathe," I said. As we walked to the parking lot, a gust of wind caught my hair, lifting it away from my face. It felt symbolic, like the world was reminding me what freedom tasted like. Sarah smiled. "Keep the documents safe," she said. "You never know when you'll need to show someone that truth has receipts." I drove home in silence, the sunlight flickering through the trees along the highway. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The bruise was almost gone. My face looked tired but steady. I thought about all the women who never got this far, whose stories were still buried under family pride and fear. I whispered to them wherever they were. We made it out. When I reached my apartment, I opened the door and stood for a long time in the quiet. The stack of files sat neatly on the table, a monument to every moment I refused to stay silent. I ran my fingers over the folder labeled Judgment. The paper was cool under my skin, but the victory burned warm. For the first time, justice didn't feel abstract. It felt personal. It felt earned. The judgment spread through my family faster than winter wind through the trees. I didn't post about it, didn't tell anyone outside my lawyer and my closest friend, but word travels when small towns smell scandal. Within a week, the phone calls started again. Not from my parents this time, but from neighbors, coworkers, even distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Some called to congratulate me quietly, their voices low, as if justice were a forbidden word. Others called to tell me I'd gone too far. The worst ones didn't call at all, they just posted. Someone leaked the case summary to a local blog about social issues in Atlanta called The Civic Lens. The headline read, "Atlanta Woman Wins Case Against Brother in Domestic Assault Lawsuit." There was no photo, just a sketch of a gavel and a family dinner table fractured down the middle. I read the article 3 times before realizing what I was feeling wasn't fear, it was validation. The story was factual, not sensationalized. It quoted the judge's closing statement about accountability within families. Sarah called me that evening, her voice buzzing with restrained excitement. "This could help other women," she said. "You should be proud." I wanted to be, but pride felt complicated. I hadn't set out to be anyone's headline. I'd just wanted to survive. Within days, the article began circulating on Facebook. The comment sections bloomed with opinions, some supportive, others cruel. "Good for her," one woman wrote. "Silence protects the abuser." Another replied, "Families should stay private. She's embarrassing them." I stopped reading after a while. Every time I scrolled, I found pieces of myself being dissected by strangers who only knew fragments of my story. But beneath the noise, something unexpected happened. Women began messaging me privately. Some were local, some from other states. Their messages started the same way I saw your story. Then they spilled their own husbands, brothers, fathers. Stories of bruises, dismissed, of apologies that came too late. I started replying one by one, not as a victim, but as someone who understood the language of survival. A week later, the Civic Lens published a follow-up article about domestic assault cases that never make it to court. They quoted me anonymously this time, using a line from our interview, "I didn't destroy the family. I just stopped bleeding for it." That sentence spread faster than the verdict. It was reposted, quoted, even printed on a local advocacy poster. Sarah called again, laughing softly. "You've gone viral," she said, "but not in the way people mean it online. You gave silence a voice." At work, things were quieter but not easier. Some coworkers treated me like I was fragile, offering forced smiles and quick exits. One manager pulled me aside and said, "I admire your courage, but maybe avoid mentioning the case here. It could make people uncomfortable." I bit back the urge to ask who people meant. Instead, I nodded and returned to my desk, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and exhaustion. That night, I added another note to my journal. Justice doesn't guarantee acceptance. Sometimes it just exposes who's allergic to truth. Meanwhile, the ripple through my family deepened. My mother stopped calling entirely. My father sent one text. "We're disappointed, but we hope you're happy." Ethan's probation began quietly, but word of his sentence made its way into the local gossip chain. Mrs. Lane told me she'd overheard someone at the grocery store whisper, "Can you believe she sued her own brother?" The woman she told off had replied, "Maybe she should have done it sooner." It was strange to realize I'd become a symbol in conversations I wasn't part of. The local church I'd grown up attending reached out next. Pastor David called, saying they were praying for reconciliation. I thanked him, though I knew reconciliation wasn't possible without truth. He invited me to speak at a women's meeting about courage, but I declined. I wasn't ready to turn my pain into a sermon. Still, the gesture lingered in my mind. A few weeks later, I found myself scrolling through The Civic Lens again. They'd posted an update about the impact of my case, mentioning how it had inspired new conversations about accountability within families. In the comment section, someone wrote, "I know her. She's stronger than people realize." I didn't recognize the username, but the words hit something deep. Maybe I didn't need to hide anymore. I decided to attend one of Sarah's advocacy events downtown, a small panel about women in tech and workplace safety. When she introduced me as a survivor who turned evidence into empowerment, the room applauded softly. I told my story without tears for the first time. Afterward, a woman approached me in the parking lot, tears streaming down her face. "Because of you, she said I called the police last night." I hugged her without knowing her name. That was the moment I understood the power of speaking not just for me, but for anyone still trapped in silence. By the end of that month, the storm had quieted. The gossip died down, replaced by new scandals, new distractions. My parents moved out of their neighborhood, claiming they needed a fresh start. Ethan's social media disappeared entirely. For once, their absence felt like peace. I spent my evenings coding updates for my app, the one that had been my lifeline long before this. It was finally gaining traction, connecting women across the country with remote tech jobs. The irony wasn't lost on me. My success built on the same resilience that had saved me. One evening, while reviewing new user registrations, I saw a familiar name. Lindsay, the coworker who'd testified about Ethan. She'd signed up to mentor new freelancers. I smiled at the screen. The circle of impact was wider than I could see. That night, as I watched the city lights flicker through my window, I realized that justice didn't roar like in the movies. It whispered. It grew slowly in the quiet aftermath, one brave story at a time. For every person who said I'd ruined the family, 10 others found courage to speak. That was a trade I could live with. When Sarah called the next morning to tell me another blog had requested an interview, I hesitated. "Do I keep talking about it?" I asked. She paused before answering. "Only if you still need to," she said. I looked out at the sunrise bleeding into the horizon and smiled. Maybe it's time to talk about what comes after. A year passed before I realized that silence no longer scared me. It used to feel like a punishment, a reminder that no one was listening, but now it felt like peace. The world hadn't turned into a fairy tale after the trial. It had just become honest. My apartment was brighter these days, with plants crowding the windowsill and books stacked on every surface. Sometimes I caught myself laughing out loud for no reason at all, surprised by how easy joy could sound when no one was waiting to interrupt it. The bruises were long gone, but their outlines lived somewhere deeper, guiding me without pain, like old maps that still knew the way. The app I'd built, the one that started as a side project no one took seriously, had grown into a full platform. I named it Haven Code, a space for women in tech to find freelance work without fear of harassment or bias. After the Civic Lens article, traffic had tripled overnight. I spent months fixing bugs, onboarding mentors, and moderating community posts from women across the country. Every time a new user signed up, it felt like reclaiming one more inch of space that the world once told me I didn't deserve. Sarah and I stayed close after the trial. She became more than a lawyer. She became my friend, my anchor. On weekends, she'd come over with takeout and 2 bottles of wine, and we'd sit on my balcony talking about everything but the past. One night she said, "You know, you should consider starting a foundation, something bigger than the app." The idea lodged in my mind like a spark. By spring, we'd launched Women Who Speak, a small nonprofit helping survivors of family violence find legal aid and remote jobs. We started with just 5 volunteers and 1 small grant. By summer, we had 50 members and enough donations to cover pro bono cases for women across 3 states. I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was building something that outlived it. The first time I spoke publicly under my own name, I was terrified. It was at a community center in Decatur, a modest room with folding chairs and coffee in styrofoam cups. The audience was mostly women my mother's age. I told them about fear, about silence, about the night that divided my life in 2. I expected pity, but what I saw in their eyes was something else: recognition. When I finished, they stood and clapped, not for what I'd endured, but for what I'd done next. That night, I realized healing wasn't a finish line. It was a conversation that never truly ended. My relationship with my parents never mended. After the verdict, they moved to Alabama to live near Dad's sister. I got one card from Mom on my birthday with a single line: "I hope you find peace." I stared at the handwriting for a long time before tucking it into a drawer. Maybe that was her way of apologizing. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I no longer needed it. Some wounds don't close with words, they close with distance. Ethan tried reaching out once through a mutual friend. He wanted to meet to talk things through. I declined. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't the same as reunion. It was setting the weight down without inviting the thief back into your home. I didn't hate him anymore, but I didn't owe him closure either. The women I met through Women Who Speak became my new family. There was Michelle, a nurse who left her abusive husband after 20 years, and Tara, a single mother who'd rebuilt her life by learning coding through the app. We held group meetings twice a month sometimes just to share food and laughter, other times to cry in safety. Each story added a layer to the collective strength we were building. Found family, Sarah called it, the kind you choose. By fall, our small nonprofit had grown into something tangible, a registered organization with real offices downtown. The first time I walked through the glass doors with our name etched in silver, I felt that strange mix of pride and disbelief again. From the girl who'd been called useless to the woman whose work was helping others stand life had rewritten itself in ways I couldn't have scripted. One afternoon, a new volunteer approached me after a meeting. She was in her 40s, soft-spoken, wearing a blue scarf that reminded me of the one Mom used to wear. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "When I read your story, I finally believed I could start over." Her eyes glistened, and before I could answer, she added, "You helped me remember who I was." I smiled and said, "You did that yourself. I just turned on the light. Sometimes I still dream about that night, the sound of glass shattering, the sharp pain, the silence after. But in the dream now, the scene shifts. I stand up, brush the dust off, and walk away into the light spilling through the open door. It doesn't haunt me anymore. It reminds me. Every ending has two halves, the breaking and the becoming. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Atlanta, I stood on my balcony watching the skyline glow gold. Sarah joined me, handing me a mug of tea. "You ever think about how far you've come?" she asked. I laughed softly. "All the time, but sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else." She nudged my shoulder. It didn't. It happened to the woman who refused to stay silent. Below us, the city buzzed with life cars honking, sirens wailing somewhere far away. For once, the noise didn't unsettle me. It grounded me. This was the sound of surviving. This was the sound of rebuilding. I looked out toward the horizon and whispered more to myself than to her. Peace isn't something they give back. It's something you build yourself. A year and a half after the verdict, I drove back to my parents' old neighborhood for the first time. The streets looked the same, oak trees arching overhead, the same cracked sidewalk near the post office, but the house wasn't ours anymore. A real estate sign stood in the yard, faded from rain, the windows dark behind drawn blinds. For a long time, I sat in the car engine off watching sunlight move across the porch where everything had changed. I wasn't there to reclaim anything. I just wanted to see it as it was, now ordinary, small, powerless. The ghosts didn't live here anymore. They lived in memory, and even those were starting to lose their sharp edges. When I drove away, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt distance, the kind that makes things safe to remember. Sarah called as I reached the highway. She was at the office planning another fundraiser for Women Who Speak. "You coming?" she asked. I smiled into the phone. Wouldn't miss it. The fundraiser was held downtown in a small art gallery lit with warm gold light. Paintings by local women lined the walls, images of resilience, of hands breaking through darkness, of cities made of fractured glass. The turnout was larger than we expected. Over 200 people filled the room, and for the first time since this all began, I saw a crowd not staring in pity, but in solidarity. There was laughter music, the clink of glasses. Sarah gave a speech about truth and courage, then called me to the stage. Standing there, looking out at all those faces, I thought about the first courtroom, the cold, echoing silence, the way my voice had trembled when I said his name aloud. Now my hands didn't shake. A few years ago, I thought survival meant staying quiet. I thought if I didn't speak, things couldn't get worse. But silence doesn't keep the peace. It just buries the war inside you. The moment you decide your story matters, everything changes. The audience listened still and intent. They called me useless. I continued. They told me I was destroying the family. Maybe I was at least the version of it that destroyed me first. I can live with that. Applause rippled through the room, soft at first, then steady. I stepped back, letting the sound wash over me like something cleansing. It wasn't validation, I felt it was release. Afterward, a woman in her 60s came up to me, tears streaking her cheeks. My daughter went through something similar, she said, gripping my hands. She never pressed charges. I wish she'd had someone like you to tell her it was okay to fight back. I squeezed her hands gently. It's never too late to choose yourself, I said. She nodded, eyes bright. In that moment, I realized closure wasn't a single event. It was a ripple that touched lives you'd never meet. Over the next few months, the nonprofit grew faster than any of us imagined. Local news outlets covered our mentorship program. One article called me the accidental activist. I laughed when I read it because that's exactly what I was, an ordinary woman who stumbled into justice and decided not to leave. Sarah kept saying we should expand nationally. I told her we'd get there one story at a time. Then, one morning in spring, a letter arrived at my office. No return address, just my name written in familiar, careful handwriting. My stomach tightened when I opened it. It was from Mom. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Her words were shaky but clear. Claire, we've moved again. Your father isn't well, but he's trying. Ethan found a job in Birmingham. I won't make excuses anymore. I've had time to think about everything, and I know I failed you. I thought keeping peace meant pretending nothing was wrong, but I see now it only made things worse. You were right to stand up for yourself. I hope one day you can forgive us, even if we don't deserve it. I just want you to know I'm proud of you, even if it's too late to say it out loud. Love, Mom. I read it twice, tears blurring the ink until the words melted together. For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to tear it up. Another part wanted to frame it. In the end, I folded it gently and placed it in the same drawer as her old birthday card. Not as closure, but as record, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes even the hardest hearts soften when the noise fades. That night, I met Sarah for dinner at our favorite rooftop restaurant overlooking downtown. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the kind of sunset that makes you forget cities can be cruel. She raised her glass toward me. To new beginnings, she said. I laughed. To endings that didn't destroy us. We clinked glasses. Later, after she left, I stayed on the terrace alone, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. I thought about everything that had happened to the courtroom, the porch, the years of silence that had shaped me into something unbreakable. I wondered what Ethan was doing somewhere in Birmingham. Was he still angry? Regretful, I didn't know, and for the first time, I didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me to stop letting his name echo in my chest. Summer came fast that year. The organization expanded to 5 states, and I spent long days on the road meeting volunteers, giving talks, and helping women apply for jobs through Haven Code. Everywhere I went, people told me their stories. Some were quiet, whispered in hallways after events. Others were loud, shouted with pride. Every time I felt the same mixture of sorrow and awe. Healing, I realized, was contagious. Once you showed someone it was possible, they passed it on. In July, Sarah and I were invited to a national conference in Washington, D.C. on women's empowerment. I spoke on a panel about digital safety and financial independence. At the end, a reporter asked, "What's the biggest lesson you've learned from all this?" I thought for a moment, then said, "That strength doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like walking away and never looking back." The audience applauded, but what stayed with me was the quiet nodding of women who understood without needing to say a word. When I returned home, I spent a quiet Sunday morning cleaning the apartment. The light fell through the window in long golden lines, catching on the photo frame on my desk, the one Sarah had gifted me after the trial. It showed me standing on the courthouse steps, face half turned toward the sun. On the back, she'd written, "She won more than a case." She won herself. I smiled, tracing the words with my thumb. Later that day, I walked to the park nearby. Families picnicked under the trees, children chasing bubbles across the grass. For a long time, I sat on a bench just watching them, thinking how strange it was that peace could look so ordinary. A little girl ran past me, laughing, her mother chasing behind her. The sound made my chest ache, not with loss, but with something gentler acceptance. As the sun dipped low, I took out my phone and opened the email app. Dozens of new messages blinked at me, requests for interviews, thank you notes from women we'd helped, and one from a journalist writing a feature on the women redefining justice. I smiled but didn't open any of them. For once, I didn't need to respond. The story had outgrown me. It belonged to everyone now. That evening back home, I made tea and stepped onto the balcony. The city was alive below me. Sirens' laughter, the hum of traffic, but for once, none of it felt heavy. I leaned against the railing, the mug warm in my hands, and whispered the words that had become my quiet prayer. They called me useless. Maybe I was until I stopped living for their approval. Now I live for the girl who woke up alone in that hospital bed and decided she deserved better. The wind carried the words away, scattering them like seeds into the night. I watched until the horizon faded into darkness, then went inside, closing the door softly behind me. For the first time in years, I didn't check the locks twice. Sometimes I still wonder what my mother's face would look like if she saw me now standing in rooms full of people who listened when I spoke, building something that mattered. Maybe one day we'll see each other again. Maybe not. Either way, I've learned that some goodbyes aren't endings. They're openings. When I finally went to bed, the city lights filtered through the curtains, painting soft patterns across the walls. The hum of the world outside felt steady like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes and breathed. There would always be echoes of that night, but they no longer owned me. They were just proof that I'd lived through something meant to break me and came out whole. And somewhere out there, I hoped another woman was watching her own sunrise, holding her own cup of coffee, whispering her own version of the same promise to never let silence win again. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it whispers. It shows up in quiet mornings when you make coffee in peace, in the steady hands that no longer shake, when you sign your own name, in the sound of your own breath that doesn't carry fear anymore. Maybe that's what survival really means, not erasing the past, but walking through it without bowing your head. People still ask me if I forgive them if I've moved on. The truth is, forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once. It's a road you travel slowly, sometimes alone, sometimes with ghosts. I don't hate my brother anymore, but I don't wish him well either. I just wish him far away. And maybe that's enough. Because peace doesn't always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from release. If you've ever been called useless, if your family ever made you feel small for not being who they wanted you to be, this story is for you. You don't need their approval to become whole. You don't need their apology to move on. You just need one decision, one moment when you stop believing the lies they built around you. For me, it happened on that cold hospital morning, staring at a ceiling light that hummed like a heartbeat, when I realized no one was coming to save me. That was the moment I stopped being their disappointment and started being my own salvation. And maybe that's what I hope for you too, to find that single spark inside yourself that says, enough. If you've ever had to stand up to family just to protect your own sanity, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your time, your truth, because you're not alone in this. Thousands of people around the world have carried that same silence, that same ache, and today, maybe for the first time, they'll hear your voice echo theirs. Share your story. Let's build a space where the quiet ones finally speak, where broken doesn't mean defeated, and where healing isn't hidden anymore. And if this story found you tonight, maybe it's because it was meant to. So don't just scroll away, stay a moment, breathe. Remember that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just says softly, but surely I'm still here. Subscribe, share, and tell me, where are you watching from and what moment made you realize you deserved better.